I'm Angie Bexley, Deputy Director of the Children's Policy Centre. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra. This is land that has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders and to past, present and future generations of their children and young people, as well as all First Nations people who might be joining us for this webinar. The Children's Policy Centre is based here at the ANU and has three key objectives. The first is to undertake innovative interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second is to seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners working on a range of issues to promote the human rights, wellbeing and best interests of children. Third, we aim to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and young people. This is the fourth In Conversation webinar with commissioners from Australia and overseas, and you can find the recording of these webinars on our website. We've discussed a wide range of topics so far, from the case of enshrining the UNCRC into Scottish law, to the challenges of the youth justice system and overrepresentation of young Aboriginal people. And last week, we began a conversation about the gendered nature of wellbeing for children and adolescents. This week celebrated the International Day of the Girl, and so it is fitting today we are discussing the gender-specific dimension of wellbeing in the context of a report titled Menstruation Matters, the Impact of Menstruation on Wellbeing, Participation and School Attendance, which was released by the Commissioner for Children and Young People in South Australia, Helen Connolly, and who we are very fortunate to have here with us today. Helen was appointed South Australia's first Commissioner for Children and Young People in 2017, and throughout her career, Helen has been an active advocate on policy issues that impact on the wellbeing of Australian families and children, with a strong focus on early intervention and prevention strategies. Prior to her appointment as Commissioner for Children and Young People, she was Executive Director of the Australian Red Cross in South Australia and Chair of the South Australian Council for Social Services Incorporated. Helen also has a fantastic Spotify list on the Commissioner's website that I really appreciated this week. Welcome, Helen. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Angie.
I should also let listeners know that we'll be speaking for a guest about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. So please pop your questions in the Q&A function, or let me know and I can dial you in, or at least try and dial you in. Helen, to kick us off, I wonder if you could begin by talking us through, I guess, the global landscape on this. So Australia, I think, has been pretty slow to address the importance of menstrual wellbeing in terms of access and stigma and the taboo associated with menstruation. And so far, Victoria and now South Australia are leading the way here. So I guess if you could just sort of paint a picture of what's being done in this space, I guess, and where the steps to get South Australia is to where it is now.
Sure. You know, and I have to say, this is not my specific area of expertise. It's something that I think there are people who've been working in this space for many, many years. So I do feel like a bit of a Johnny-come-lately, but it's something that since it was raised with me by so many kind of girls and young women as an issue that they wanted to talk to me about when I was out talking about other issues, I kind of dove into it a little bit more. So, and in doing so, discovered that there is this international community, as you say, that really is about trying to push what they're calling dignified menstruation. So pretty much global south kind of countries were the forefront of this, and it really is about creating a life for menstruators that's free of abuse and shame and stigma and taboo. I think, so last year I know that I spoke at an international conference on dignified menstruation, which was being run out of Nepal, and they were saying that because of, I guess, the extreme nature of the stigma around blood, menstrual blood and menstruators and the cultural implications, that it was such a front of mind issue for them that they'd been really pushing that. And it was really interesting in speaking with them to say, whilst our I guess, stigma and taboo is not quite as in your face, so to speak, it is still very much there. So, and then the more we kind of looked around, certainly the UK has been leading significant work on the issue of period poverty. So there's a number of different names and it covers off on some different things. So in the UK, period poverty and the access for menstruators to products has been a significant issue that led to them having a period poverty task force, which led to, in particular, Scotland, I think, passed their laws to say that they would make products available in all public spaces. So that's been some of the work there. They then have put it into legislation. New Zealand, I think, has also been taken a real period poverty focus as well, and really tried to kind of do things around the tax on products, those kind of things. So everyone's taking a slightly different approach. So for us here in South Australia, we had a bit of a, so period poverty probably was known but not necessarily termed as such here. And we had been having some charities in particular who'd been supplying products for many years. But I think what we've done more recently is to kind of unify behind almost like a kind of almost a campaigning feel around saying that the whole approach to menstruation, we've got to get better at it, because at the core, this for me is a gender equity and gender equality issue. So that gives you a bit of a flavour. I think in Brazil this week, they had a bill through their parliament saying they wanted to supply products as well. It got defeated, and defeated in a very gendered, sexist kind of language way. So again, this is all part of this kind of murmurings and movements across the world.
Yeah, and it's fantastic to see, but as you say, for the most part, menstruation has been pretty overlooked so far in terms of policies and practice, and also in assessments in our work of poverty on a global level have really failed to take into account this specific focus on women's health. And as you raised there, you see it as a gender equality issue. Could you speak a little bit more around why it's important to shift this focus from a individual women's only problem to being a society-wide problem or responsibility?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, I was driving to work this morning and was listening to the radio, and they were saying that even in other health and medical research that there'd been not enough looking at how females respond to certain treatment types. So it kind of is this whole space, isn't it, that policy laws have been traditionally made by adults and adult men, and therefore children's issues tend to get overlooked, and women's issues as seen, as being not as important. So that's, I guess, the kind of where my framing has come from. So I started, I've been doing a lot of work with kids. I did a big piece of work on poverty. What came out was very much around period poverty. The kids were saying they weren't going to school because they couldn't afford products. That then led to some further conversations around that particular aspect, and to really dive into like what was going on in schools and where this was sitting. And in doing so, it became really obvious to me that this was far more than access to products. So it was in fact about menstruators saying that they avoid participation. So it was having a dramatic impact on their participation in education, in sport, in work, in ways that I don't think I certainly hadn't thought of before listening to all these young women who were saying, if you're in a fast food joint and you're 15 years old and that's your job, or you're on the checkout of a retail shop, you can't leave. And so your breaks are very defined. And if you're really worried about leaking, or you've got, pain that comes and goes, then you don't go to work. So you refuse a shift when you have your period. And so I thought that was a really interesting kind of take on, wow, if we're talking about increasing in participation, women's participation in work, then that is a significant issue. We also heard that they're just not playing sport. So that's I think an obvious one, but it also, having lots of conversations with sporting codes about the drop-off of, you know, 12, 13-year-olds, girls, stop playing sport. No one had kind of made that. I mean, I think probably somewhere in the back of their head they thought about it, but the overt kind of policy implications of that and the relationship to menstruation, I think, had been lost. So what is it that stops them participating, particularly fear and, you know, the whole uniform thing, you know, leakage, all those kind of things was stopping girls playing sport. Then we had the whole schooling thing. So girls saying it's just too hard to go to school when you've got your period. So either you're restricted access to bathrooms, you don't have bins, the whole, like there's just so much around that. So when you start to think about it in terms of its broad impact on how many kind of days lost of education there are because of periods, then you add in the product issues, then you add in non-participation in sport and in work, and that general almost, you know, fear that, and bullying was another issue that came up, particularly mixed gender and the kind of bullying of boys to girls when they're around periods and bleeding and all sorts of things. It just meant for me, this is you know, about the impact of periods, and the impact is inequality, and it's just not fair to actually not address that as an everybody's policy issue. So if we keep on saying, well, this is a personal medical, and it's not even, I mean, we say it's not medical, it just is. So we need to get to that space where we actually acknowledge that it is impacting on the human rights and safety and participation of menstruators.
Yep, yeah. And I was really struck, your report, Menstruation Matters, is based on 3,000 survey responses with children aged from 7 to 22, with that most of them being in that middle age range. And there's such a high level of participation and engagement with your surveys, and the depth and detail of children and young people's responses really indicates that, you know, menstruation is just not an issue that they have an opportunity to talk about, despite how significantly it's impacting on their lives. I was interested if you saw, or to talk more about, I guess, the link with wellbeing, and in last week's webinar, your WA colleague Colin Pettit was talking about the findings in his report that sort of map onto this downward trend of wellbeing for girls. And so I was just wondering a little bit more about, you know, all of these things are impacting on wellbeing. Did you find anything specific around the relationship with mental health itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, the number of surveys we got is quite staggering, given that they are qualitative. They're not just tick and flick. They do take some time to actually complete. The fact that we got so many and that they really did want to tell us everything about it. So huge, you know, I get pages and pages of written responses to individual questions, I think is phenomenal. So what they're talking about is, I guess, that well-being. So that general sense of anxiety, so being anxious about having their periods and not having anyone to talk to about it. So anxiety about leaking, around all the things around access. So that's an issue. There's a real shame for some people about product buying. And interestingly, some of the ones that really I remember were girls who said, you know, that they were in sole parent families headed by males. And so they didn't feel that they could get their dads or their male carers to kind of buy stuff for them. And so what that did for them was really make them feel really stressed, I guess. There was just the whole lots of, and we had quite a few culturally and linguistically diverse participants as well, who talked about inability to participate in cultural activities and religious activities, and that they felt that therefore they were being excluded, and that created a level of distress for them. So all of those kind of things, and whilst they're cumulative, I think, so when you've got those things happening and you may have other identity-related issues. So we had a lot of, gender diverse kids, or kids who are caring, or kids with disabilities, all of those kind of things. It's a layering, I think, of issues related to feeling different or othered or not included, and then not having anywhere to really talk about it. And the other thing I think was really common was for those who had had really significant pain or discomfort or heavy kind of periods, who really didn't have a sense of, is this normal? So the most common question I get when I'm with groups is this okay? Is this normal? Do you think I should go to a doctor? And so it makes me really worried that we haven't created safe spaces for those conversations to be had. And so then kids are going to the internet to search for all sorts of things, and then we get all of the things that come with kind of those kind of searches.
Yeah, and this absence of information that people have access to in regards to sexual and reproductive health, more broadly, and that came out in your report, and also talking to Colin last week, is something that's really striking. And the other thing that struck me also in your report comes out just when you asked people, what do you need? They said, we need more education.
Yeah.
That's what they're saying, and that they need it in earlier years, and that it should be made accessible to everyone, regardless of their gender identity, I think is really striking. What did they have to say in terms of the media that they're interacting with, or when they go on and search for these things, and the things like, there's just this complete sort of dearth of the right sorts of information for them? What did they say about that?
Yeah, look, and I think this feeds into what kids generally say. There's a lot of stuff out there. So, there's an overload of information. Yeah. What they need is curated information that's educative and age appropriate. So I think that's the key. They need to know, I think with so much of everything now, we need to kind of help them and say, this is a trusted place. You can go and ask really open and honest conversations. I guess, and to be fair, I don't think that they're government websites. I don't think that they are the kind of, that wouldn't be what I think government would be known for having very frank and fearless kind of advice for kids. But it is what's needed. But fundamentally, this is about education. So what we're saying is, and I followed up the Menstruation Matters report with the sex education report in South Australian schools. And again, in that, there was a couple of thousand responses in that one. So they were pretty keen to talk about that and the lack of knowledge they have, and in particular around menstruation. So again, boys and girls saying this wasn't covered. Everyone's saying this should be kind of for everyone, and it needs to be in primary school. Because one of the things we did see with the participants was most of them got their period in primary school, and the primary schools weren't particularly, set up to deal with it well. And primary schools tend to use a lot of code and wouldn't kind of, it was all a bit secretive. And if you need something, you've got to go to the teacher, and it's all a bit whispered and quiet and code words and stuff. And we're saying, actually, and they're saying, we need to get over this, really. Yeah. And we need to be able to say that, if you have your period, this is where the stuff is. You can just go and help yourself to it. No one needs to kind of come and jump through flaming hoops to be able to access a pad if you need it. So it's those kind of things, I think, that we need to set the culture early in education, and we need to follow through with really comprehensive menstrual awareness, menstrual education, and product. So
yeah, and that normalising of it, and a culture to name it firstly, and not being so secretive about it. It's 2021, for God's sake.
Exactly.
And I guess that, there has been some movement. The organisation Taboo co-founder Isabel Marshall was named 2021 Young Australian of the Year in recognition of her work against the stigma here in Australia and abroad. But what more do you think needs to be done to end this inequality and acknowledge menstrual well-being as a desired health outcome, and make that relationship clear between menstruation, systemic gender disparities, and participation of children and young people across our communities, not just in schools?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've said that you're pretty hard pushed to find menstruation mentioned in any health documents. So health policies really, and even women's health policies, kind of really silent on this. So I think one of the critical things is that it needs to be seen as an essential part of health, and that we need to kind of name it there and ensure that, you know, there's a whole range of access to services, but access to information, early warnings of endometriosis, whatever it might be. We need to get that kind of health, the menstruation in all policies, I think. I think there's also, you know, there's been a push from particularly the Victorian Women's Trust, who've done some really interesting stuff on saying we need a menstrual leave policy in workplaces. So women have to take sick leave, and they're saying it's not a sickness. Sometimes it's just about being able to work, you know, working from home is now more common. So as we kind of, as this, you know, we come out of COVID and we go back to offices, etc., there just needs to be the capacity to realise that, you know, you can sit on the couch with a hot water bottle on your tummy and actually work. Like, there is a comfort level to that. So maybe, you know, we just need to be flexible and free around that. But also just in workplaces, recognising that, you know, that's an okay thing to do. If someone's got a bad back, we don't flinch when we see people doing all sorts of things that work for their back and contraptions, but we seem to think that there's something quite odd about periods. So what do we need in our workplaces to kind of have more of a kind of openness to the fact that, you know, more than 50% of the population bleed, and they bleed every month for years and years and years, and so we just need to kind of deal with it. Things like in workplaces in particular where we do have young women, the toilet stuff is huge. You know, I think I joke often that I could do a PhD just on toilets and just how the social kind of stigma around toilet access, and just the horror stories I hear about bathrooms and about how dirty they are, how they're shared, how they don't have bin access, how and asking permission to use the bathroom. So I would suggest that in education, that the act of asking for bathroom access is a pretty discriminatory practice. And that we need to really think about what are we saying to people. So how are we empowering children as well in terms of some pretty basic rights to go to a bathroom? Now, I understand, and teachers will tell me, that bathrooms are pretty contested spaces in schools, but we're going to have to get better at having single stalls and, you know, all those kind of things. So I think there's a whole physical infrastructure we need to understand as well. I'm just trying to think. So I think there's a range of different things that we can do to actually say, if we're conscious of it and we try to do something to change the stigma, taboo, discrimination, abuse, then we can probably think of a whole heap of different ways to do that across the board. Access to products in public places. You know, I've been doing some work I had a period summit this year also, and I think we had 100, it was fantastic. But people were saying, oh, you know, we looked at our workplace before we came here, and if anyone had come in needing, you know, products, there's no way they could get them. And this, some of them from the hospital. So, you know, we're talking about how do we, you know, no one's asking when you go into institutions what you need, all those kind of things. So there's application, I think, in every program, every service, every public place to actually think about what our response to menstruation is.
Yes, and it needs to be that multi-pronged and multi-level. It's not just one thing in one sector that's going to be able to fix this, right? And I'm really looking forward to your PhD on toilets. I think there's so much there. It's worthy of a PhD, I think. Helen, next week is Anti-Poverty Week, and your work in South Australia has also been concerned with looking at systemic and structural barriers for children and young people living in poverty. Could you talk us through some of the work that predated this work on focusing on menstruation? And how important do you think it is to look beyond income-based measures to try and understand the multidimensional experience of poverty for children and young people?
Sure. As you say, so in my intro, I'm the inaugural commissioner. So when I started in 2017, and I have a very broad mandate to work with all South Australian children on rights and interests and wellbeing. So that's huge. Where do you start? So I thought I'd go out and speak to kids about, in the first instance, to set my strategic agenda. So I talked to a few thousand kids. I went all over South Australia and distilled down the kind of top priority areas they wanted me to do something about. So if I was going to be successful in my role, in my 5-year term, what was it that they wanted me to do? One of the things that they said was they wanted to help poor kids. So probably, I think it's number 3 thing, so pretty high up out of 5. In the second year, I started to do some deep dives into the areas they asked me to look at. And so I thought, look, what do kids actually mean by that? So I went out and did quite a bit of work in terms of going out and speaking to kids who had experienced poverty and those who hadn't, to say, what do you mean by help poor kids? Who are poor kids? What does poor look like for children? So we did quite a big report, which was called Leave No One Behind. And so it is about what kids have said about the experiences of poverty, which is where all of those things like, where the period poverty stuff came out. It was in terms of kids saying, we don't have deodorant and soap and shampoo and all those kind of things and period products. So that was a really important part of it. But then it was just all of the other things related to missing out. So what do they miss out on when they go to school? So they soon become really clear about understanding they don't ask for things, or some of them were saying they don't go to school on certain days. So if there's a special day at school, a book week parade, they won't go on those days. If there's an excursion, they're really feeling that they can't share that with mum and dad and ask for it because they know that's going to put a stress, etc., etc. So there was a range. So they had it across all aspects of their life. The kind of opportunity poverty was missing. They couldn't do sport, they couldn't get to transport, they were getting kicked out of school for not having the right uniform or not wearing the right shoes or whatever it was. It was a litany of kind of impacts of acts of their parents' lack of money meant on their lives. So we looked at that, and since then have done a couple of things. So we did a bit of a deep dive into the period stuff, which led to the Menstruation Report. I've done another one into digital poverty. So the data access to data was huge. So no Wi-Fi at home, having to go to Macca's or the library to complete homework, one device shared amongst many, those kind of issues. So I did another really big deep dive into that, which is my Digital Life report, which came out earlier a few months ago. And then this week for Anti-Poverty Week, I've just done a bit of a desktop look at the true cost of going to school. So one of the things we know is that there are fees, and we have a public education charter that says you can't be excluded from school for not being able to pay fees, and that's all good, and we have school card and financial assistance. But all the non-essential, what are deemed non-essential items, which are actually the experience of going to school, aren't covered by that. So, graduation photos, your year 7 jumper, your uniform, your sports kit, your data, your stationery, all of those kind of things which are deemed non-essential are actually the things that obviously make a difference in the lives of children. So that's their experience of going to school. So we've also kind of said we need to get better at recognising that and providing response, financial support and assistance around that. Lunches, school holiday thing, all, you know, so there's a kind of big list of those. So I continue to kind of, from what they told me in the first instance, now to continue to kind of dive into some of these areas to really spotlight them a bit and say, look, these are issues for kids' everyday lives. And the cumulative impact of missing out and being excluded is not great for anyone, but for their well-being, it's significant.
Yeah, and I guess it's also about through all of your work. I guess there's this stream of shifting away from it's the individualizing, stigmatizing experience of poverty. But we need to think bigger and we need to think better about understanding these systemic and structural barriers for children and young people to what is their experience and how do we help to move out of them as a society. So one more question before we can open up here and take some other questions. How do you think we move forward then in changing this conversation away from this stigmatising, you know, individual blame to it's all of our problem, it's a societal problem?
Oh, wouldn't it be great if I had the answer to that? Look,
it's a big one.
It is a big one. Fundamentally, I think that we still don't value children. So I think, you know, we have pockets of involvement and participation, but across the board, their voice as citizens isn't heard. And so what they're telling us isn't acted upon. So I think we have to get better at, you know, privileging the voice of children in policy. I think once you do that and you hear what they have to say, it becomes really obvious to me that inequality is not an individual issue that only impacts on an individual, it impacts the collective. And kids know it, and they want others to feel included and to be happy and for everyone to be kind and all of those really basic kind of values. So that understanding that inequality is bad for us all, that excluded kids is bad for us all, is a really important part of shifting our thinking in this space. If we get to a point where we can really embed that, then we've got some chance, I think, of them bringing in a rights agenda. We're very, you know, we're frightened of the rights conversation, I think, in Australia still. Why do you think that is? I just don't think we've had... It hasn't obviously been part of our kind of culture or approach. We're quite good at needs, and we're quite good at you know, at that whole spirit of volunteering and for helping and for you know, bushfire responses, disasters. So we're a giving culture, I think, but not necessarily a culture that says that this isn't about need, this is about rights. So we've never been that. And I think until we say it's a rights agenda and that if anyone isn't, you know, that is 100%, we'll be still stuck in a bit of an individualised kind of response. So my musings, I'm not sure if they're, you know, they're necessarily the right thing, but certainly from where I stand, trying to push the voice of kids into policy, I think they've got some pretty impressive kind of contextual information for us. Yeah,
and it absolutely has to start there. And, you know, people, you know, there's always those debates of, you know, well, you know, it can be quite tokenistic to get children to participate. And I think we just need to keep trying, right? You just need to keep trying and making those spaces for children at the table to voice their concerns is just, that's where you have to start. And as you say, it's those roll-on effects then of how it's taken up and how change can happen. And you know, even just this year, you know, the 18-year-old who got the law changed around, I think, of course, the government's going to dispute it, around the government being responsible for environmental and climate change and environmental damage. You know, that's a group of 8 kids and helped by a nun, I think. You know, it's possible. So I'd just like to open it up for anyone who'd like to ask a question of Helen and her work, and it's amazing breadth of work that you've done, Helen, ranging from poverty and the digital agenda. I mean, there's such a huge range of topics that you've covered. Sharon, would you like to come in? I don't know if she's still there. No, we've lost her.
No. I mean, I guess one of the things I think is in terms of bringing children's voice in, I think we also have to get a bit more creative. So certainly one of the things, as you say, my work has been quite broad. In particular, because they asked me to do the poverty bit, they asked me to look at who was being excluded from school, they asked me to look at bullying, and they asked me to look at preparedness for adulthood. So they were pretty broad kind of agendas anyway. But one of the things we've been doing with the 8 to 12-year-olds in particular, so those primary school age children, is not last year, the year before, sent out postcards. So they're very, you know, they're little postcards. They've got a little avatar of me on the front, and they ask 4 questions, which are pretty broad about good things, bad things, things you'd want to change. And I've had, so I'm now collecting the ones in the 3rd year. So there'll be 4-year cycle. So each year we'll have different questions, and then we'll do it again. So that a kid will get in their primary school will get a different one every year if the school did it. So I've had like 20,000 cards, maybe. Wow. Maybe more. And we counted this lot that are coming in at the moment. So this and what they say is real. You know, so what they're saying to me is, this is what worries us. This is what we think should change. But I would have to say the most sobering thing that I think has come out in the ones from last year was around their views of adulthood and how they see collectively that adults are stressed and anxious and don't have many friends and don't have much fun, and generally adulthood is something that they're not aspiring to. And I think for some of my age, that is not how I saw adulthood when I was a child. I saw it as ultimate freedom, you know, money, you do whatever you want to, no one can tell. So it was a really different sense. Yes. And so kids collectively are kind of thinking that being an adult sucks. And so we need to think about, what is the relationship that we collectively have with children? That means that, you know, nearly everyone in their life probably talks about how stressed and overworked they are. And I think it's a little bit contagious. Yes. And yes, there are a whole heap of environments and causes and all the things around that. But I think we need to maybe take a little bit of mental stock about the messaging that's kind of washing over children all the time. Yes, and I guess that
and just the awareness that children are taking this on, you know, and they don't necessarily have the outlets that adults do to deal with those stresses. They're taking this on. So yeah, long term, as you say, what's it doing to them? How is it, you know, shaping their ideas about, well, their worldviews? Sharon has a question. Apologies, her mic is playing up. Sharon asks, on the issue of poverty, what are Helen's thoughts on how we ensure that children and young people who are living in situations of poverty have the opportunity to engage in forums for participation, particularly at school, which children in disadvantage are often excluded from? And I would like to hear that one first, and then there's another one.
So I think, you know, this is the balance always between, you know, identifying people for their otherness, and how we do that in a way that's respectful and safe, which is why most of my engagement with kids is kids as citizens. So I don't generally do much unless it's a really targeted thing around like kids with a disability and they already identify in that way, or trans and gender diverse kids and they've identified in that way. So it's a really tricky balance about me identifying them or how they identify themselves, which is why I think that structural conversation is really important. So every school, I think, should say, who have we got in our community? You know, the schools aren't huge. I mean, they're big, but who have we got in our community, and what are the things that may be causing them, if they are living, if they're the 1 in 4 South Australian children who are growing up in the poorest households, what in our school is making them feel not included? What are we doing? And I think the work is for the adults to identify the structural and system barriers and then to work on that in a really inclusive way with all children. But we have to have the conversation openly and honestly, because one of the things I heard this year at the other end of the spectrum was I've been working with Year 12s, and one of the Year 12 classes had said to me, we can't have a graduation anymore because the poor kids in our school can't afford it, and so they've cut it for everyone. So we can't do that. So we can't have a response that further stigmatises and isolates, because then because everyone in school knows who's who, and so they kind of blame. So you think, I could see where the school had made a call and thought they were being incredibly inclusive, but the practice of doing it actually was making it more exclusive.
Yeah, don't cancel it.
No, so rather than cancelling it, what do we do to ensure that it's equitable, or how do you make it into something where, you know, everyone needs to wear op-shop clothes, whatever. I don't know. There'll be a million ways of doing something, but I think we have to, when we involve children in this, we need to get them to help create the solution. So I think if that had been handled differently and they said, look, we think that at a social justice level, it's not fair for us as a school to continue to do this. What would you suggest? How would we come up with it? Would have been a much better solution than cancelling something where everyone was irate about it. So
yeah, no, cancel culture. It has its place and it doesn't have its place. Sharon has a further question on how we can reframe the conversations on menstruation. So it is to normalise, so it's normalised, and the embarrassment so many young girls and women feel is removed. Is a public information campaign needed? Asked Sharon.
I think it's a public health approach, absolutely. Like, I do think we have to, you know, it is about the little things, like one of the supermarket chains, I think, was trying to put up period products on the aisle rather than sanitary. So it's about looking at those kind of things. So working at all sorts of different levels. So certainly the media story. So kids were really clear about saying, you know, we still do have, you know, the white dresses, daisies and floating around in fields kind of field to stuff. So how do we actually ensure, and I'm not sure still if you're allowed to show menstrual blood on TV, but it's those kind of things. So we've got a massive canvas on the wall in this office that we did at the summit, which is all messages about periods, and we've got pictures of pads and all sorts of things everywhere. And, you know, it's a little bit in your face, but we're saying you actually do need to see visible signs. So girls, young ones, do need to see it's all kind of like, oh yeah, this is all okay. I'm doing some work at the moment with sporting codes and working up a period-friendly club code. So what does that look like? You know, I had a fantastic conversation with young gymnasts the other week, and, you know, they were saying, and again, no one had ever had a conversation with them about their periods. So there's me, complete stranger, in a room with a bunch of girls, couldn't keep them quiet because they'd never had this conversation. They were worried about strings showing. They were worried about, you know, they wanted to wear shorts. They wanted to not, and, you know, there was this kind of rule that you could maybe wear your shorts, but then everyone would know that you had your period because that was the only people who were allowed. Anyway, a whole range of things around how do we just say, no, these are not comfortable. They're not comfortable generally to wear a leotard, but they're not comfortable when you got your period. And also, you might be more prone to injury. So, you know, there's a whole heap of research now around the relationship between injury and periods. I just think if we kind of blow it all over and say, actually, this part of women's bodies is more than biology. It is actually impacting on all sorts of things. Then I reckon we'll get pretty good at kind of having the conversation more broadly. I know I've had contact with a lot of researchers from around the country who are pretty keen. We're going to have a bit of a show and tell workshop in a few weeks to say what's everyone doing, how might we actually kind of collectively raise this as an issue across health and policy agendas. So I think there's a million ways. I think I'm doing the period friendly clubs as my kind of thing, but menstrual International Dignified Menstruation Day, or whatever it's called, is December 8th. I'm trying to get a big mural up on a big wall in Adelaide CBD, again, to get people to go, oh God, but just to stop this.
Yeah, to normalise
it. Like, it's just crazy.
Yeah. Tell us more about what came out of the summit, was it Menstruation Summit? Was that what it was called?
The Period Summit. So the Period Summit was a really lovely collaboration between, Taboo, who you mentioned before. So Taboo, Share the Dignity, Modi Body, Period Revolution, Chalice Foundation and myself. So kind of people covering research, menstrual education, and then product supply. So we had... So it was just it was a fabulous day. It was actually it was really one of those incredibly empowering days where we had people talking about their work from a whole range of different perspectives. So from that, I've said I'll kind of pull together the researchers who'd shared their work, but there was also trying to create a bit of a collective around the people who are in the product supply, like how do you actually get them aligned. The environmental impacts of pads and tampons was really interesting, and I think in particular there was a real lack of knowledge by the people who completed my survey on product options. So really hadn't were worried or not sure about menstrual cups, period undies, those kind of things. So I think there's a bit of education around that's needed. I think there's a bit of fear around using them. So the Period Summit was a celebration, all things period, and it was really empowering, and just this sense of understanding just the power, and it sounds a little bit whatever. But, you know, this kind of, the menstrual cycle is a pretty critical kind of part of who we are. It's not something I think we understand. So when I talk to girls, I say, how long is your period for? And they say, oh, 4 or 5 days. I say, no, your period's actually the whole thing. Like it's the 28, 30 days. It's like it has these impacts across all of your life. And they go, oh. And so once you start talking to them, they go, oh, is that why, you know, such and such? Or so we just got to talk it.
Yeah, you just got to talk it and keep talking it. And it's, you know, as time goes on, and, you know, you've done such a fantastic, amazing work, and I can't wait to see your mural in the CBD. It's something to really look forward to. But as you say, it's, you know, it's getting all of these things coming together. It can't be just you know, a one focus approach. It's a multi-sector, but it's also a public health issue, which, you know, necessarily involves so many sectors, and not just schools, but communities and sports clubs, as you say. It's been such a pleasure, and I hope you can come back, Helen, and speak to us more about your work, and perhaps a specific segment on your digital work. I think that's just so important. We might wrap it up. A reminder to everyone that this webinar series, which began with Bruce Adamson, the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Scotland, is available on our website, and we'll be back on Thursday, the 28th of October, where we'll be in conversation with the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Victoria, Leanna Buchanan, to talk about protecting the human rights of Victoria's most vulnerable children. But for now, Helen, again, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, and to hear your insights and all of the important work that you do. And, you know, there's so many challenges there, as you say, around not just access, but information. But also, you know, your really positive thoughts about how we can move forward and make gender equality really at the centre of making our society more inclusive is just so important. And we can't wait for you to come back and join us again. But thank you so much, Helen. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you in the next conversation.